GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We're in the home stretch of today's show, but these last two segments should be really, really interesting and fun ones, so do stick around for them. We move from guys who I think are primed for big bounce back years, guys willing to take a risk on, to guys who may be a bit overvalued in terms of their ADP, and we'll get into what that means if you're new to fantasy in a minute. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Starting off hot, really, in my opinion, with a guy who, while he was a tight end one last year, really might not be in a season where all these different tight ends are really going to shine. So this is a guy who still is one of the best tight ends in the league, but you might be overrating slightly, and that is Sam Laporta of the Detroit Lions. Right now, his ADP, which, if you're new to fantasy, is average draft position, where they are projected to go in a typical fantasy draft, is 29.8, so he's sitting kind of in the third round, which is really good for a tight end. But in terms of what PFF is saying, Pro Football Focus, he's not necessarily one of the best tight end ones we've had in recent years. In fact, last year when he was the tight end one, it was the worst tight end one season since 2017. So as you can see, while Sam Laporta was a top dog in terms of fantasy production last year, it wasn't as convincing as previous years where tight ends really broke out. And in terms of the Lions' offense, I really think that Sam Laporta's production will go down. It's just a very exciting offense. Obviously, the emergence of Jameson Williams as he comes back after being suspended for most of the last season, and obviously Amon-Ra St. Brown becoming a top 5 wide receiver in the NFL, in my opinion, when he's on his game. I think that Sam Laporta, even though he's a very interesting part of this Lions offense and what Ben Johnson does with it, I just think his production will wane a little bit because of the fact they have so much talent at the position. Jared Goff is willing to spread the wealth around, and maybe there was a reason as to why his tight end one performance last year was not as convincing. So look to fade Sam Laporta. I know it's kind of shocking to say because he has been such a huge name in terms of the fantasy rumor mills and the way he stepped up last year for this Lions offense. But right now, I think that he's one of those players who, if you look at his fantasy metrics, aren't as impressive as some others. He's sitting way below the median in terms of certain fantasy scoring metrics, behind guys who are much more high profile than like guys like Travis Kelce's, even Jake Ferguson, Trey McBride, guys of that nature, really showing that they are the ones who should be looked at in terms of fantasy and not Sam Laporta. There are a lot of worrying storylines and threads to kind of point to the fact that Sam Laporta isn't as convincing as people think. But coming in next, a running back who moves to a team that's not necessarily known for their run-first philosophy in Josh Jacobs. I think that Josh Jacobs, he's really had a very weird fantasy career, in my opinion. He was as high as RB3, but then he had years where he was as low as RB12, and just speaks to the fact that he hasn't had that much volume or efficiency in previous years. Now he moves to a Green Bay Packers team where he's not the number one option anymore, and he's not going to see as many carries as people expect. I think that he had a much better situation in Las Vegas, where he was seen as the heartbeat of that offense. But now, Green Bay Packers offense with Jordan Love and these young receivers who are really exciting, and I want to see what they do next year, and a running back in A.J. Dillon who's really stepping up into their role. Obviously, he's going to be the RB1 in my opinion because of the fact that they lose Aaron Jones. But as we see with Josh Jacobs, he now has to take a back seat he's very unfamiliar with. Right now, his average draft position is mid-4th round, and I actually think that's a bit too high for him. I would fade Josh Jacobs a lot more than I would say Sam Laporta right now. He is very low in a lot of projections, only 39th out of 49 qualified running backs in terms of rushing yards over expected. So you can see his decline as he progresses through the years. And here's an interesting fact about Packers running backs that should really make you wary of choosing a guy like Josh Jacobs or even a guy like A.J. Dillon, however exciting he may be. No Packers running back has eclipsed 240 carries since Eddie Lacy, remember him, in 2014. So as you can see, the Packers really are not that worried about their running backs. Obviously, that could be a testament to the fact that Mike McCarthy's now gone and Matt LaFleur has really looked to try and establish a young quarterback in Jordan Love as a passer. But going forward, I think that these two running backs are guys I would fade. I do like A.J. Dillon, and I think he's going to be the RB1, but Josh Jacobs is someone I'm really, really wary about. Another running back who I'm kind of wary about as well is a guy in Rachaad White who does not scream RB1 to me. Obviously, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have not been known for good running backs, not since Doug Martin did they have a reliable option at the running back position. But Rachaad White as well is one of those guys who would just fade. Right now, his average draft position sits at 56.5, kind of in those mid-third, fourth round ranges. And the big question about him is, will he keep his job? Obviously, they drafted a couple of nice prospects. They have a guy in Chase Edmonds who I really like. Sean Tucker's one of the more underrated college running backs of the past couple of years. He comes into this team. So it's just a question of who the Tampa Bay Buccaneers want at that position. I think it's one of those weird running back rooms where no one is seen above the other guy. And I think that they're just going to rotate in and out. There's going to be limited minutes for each and every single one of them, and Rachaad White might fall to the wayside because of it. In terms of efficiency, I just think that with the touches he does get, he needs to prove that he can be one of those bell cow kind of running backs who doesn't necessarily score touchdowns, but can get you a nice number of yards for your fantasy squad. I think that Rachaad White, should he be one of those players who breaks out, needs to do it in terms of yards, because right now I don't necessarily see him as much of a touchdown threat. So these three guys, I think, Sam Laporta, Josh Jacobs, and Rachaad White, have really a lot of things in common. One, they're in position groups that really are very crowded. Obviously with Sam Laporta, obviously he's the number one tight end in Detroit still, but he's still in a wide receiver or skill position group rather that really is going to be elevated due to the fact that you have guys who are on the rise at each of their respective positions, and the emergence of Jameson Williams could really hurt him as well, like I said. And then a guy in Josh Jacobs who really moves away from, I think, a better position for him to a team that hasn't really been a run-first squad. And then last but not least in Rachaad White, who just simply needs to stay on the field to prove himself. I just think that none of these guys in my mind are necessarily too overrated, but they're guys who I would just be wary of drafting, in my opinion. I think that PFF got these guys right on the money because of the fact that they're either not in necessarily good situations for who they are as players, but also the fact that they haven't really been impressive in terms of the number one thing that's important, and that's fantasy metrics. So looking at these three players, I think that take them at your own peril. I really think that Sam Laporta is the one guy I wouldn't have put on this list just because he did have a tight end one season and he was a rookie. But I can get where they are coming from with it. Josh Jacobs and Rachaad White, however, I really think you should fade. But that's just coming from me. And that should just about do it for the fourth segment of today's show. Coming up in the last segment, I'm really, really thrilled and excited to offer you guys even more Euros action. We talked about drafting your fantasy squad, the guidelines and rules for how to play. Now I'm going to give you tips and tricks. If you haven't started thinking about your Euros fantasy squad, do it now because of these tips and tricks I'm about to tell you coming back from the break. We will be right back to discuss that. It should be a can't miss segment.